The starter knife and fork. In this lesson, we're going to look at the starter knife and fork. We'll be looking at their appearance and purpose, placement, where they go on the setting, and replacement cutlery. What to do if you don't have a starter knife or fork available. Let's start with appearance and purpose. The starter knife and fork are the perfect size and shape to enjoy your starter. Generally, the dishes served during the starter course are smaller and more delicate than the main course meal, and so the starter cutlery is also smaller and lighter in weight. Because of the size, the starter knife is also often used as a butter knife on the setting. Compare the starter knife and main course knife. Notice the size difference. This is because starter dishes generally don't require heavy cutting. This is not the case with the main course knife, which cuts through the heavier food that is usually served as a main course. Hang on. Did you notice anything wrong with this main course knife? It has a dirty smudge on the blade and should never be placed in front of a guest. Well done if you noticed this. Moving on. With the starter fork, the same principles apply as with the starter knife. The starter fork is smaller and more dainty than the main course fork, because the starter course is usually lighter. Now let's talk about where to place them on the setting. As guests progress through their dining experience, they will use their cutlery from the outside in. So where do you think the starter cutlery will go? The starter knife and fork are placed on the outside of the main course knife and fork, because a starter comes before a main course. As you know, most people are right-handed. Now if you think about eating with a knife and fork, it's the knife that does most of the work, moving back and forth. For this reason, it's most comfortable to place the knife on the right and the fork on the left. So a rule when setting cutlery is that when a knife is paired with a fork, as they are here, the knife will always go on the right-hand side and the fork will be placed on the left-hand side. There are two ways to place forks on the setting. The way which is most common is to place it with the prongs pointing upwards. However, at some establishments they might be placed with prongs pointing down, like this. Make sure you know what the standard is at your property. So, what about guests that we notice are left-handed then? How do you think we can adjust or tailor our service for them? If you notice that they switch their cutlery around, you can deliver their fork on the right and their knife on the left next time. Finally, let's finish off with replacement cutlery. Sometimes, certain cutlery items will not be available, or perhaps there won't be enough in stock. But you obviously still need to provide the guest with cutlery. In the case of not having starter cutlery, a main course knife and fork is the best replacement, since they are the closest in shape and size. But remember to be consistent. Don't give the guest a starter knife paired with a main course fork. So what did you learn in this lesson? Can you remember the 3 main points? The appearance and purpose of the starter cutlery, their placement, where they go on the setting, and replacements, what to do if you don't have a starter knife or fork available. Well done if you were able to remember all 3. If not, go back and have another look at this lesson. Good luck. The main course knife and fork. Let's take a look at the main course knife and fork, and in particular, the following points. Their appearance and purpose, placement, where they go on the setting, and replacement cutlery. What to do if you don't have main course cutlery. Let's begin with appearance and purpose. The main course knife and fork are the perfect size and shape to enjoy a main meal. Generally, the main course is heavier and comes in bigger portions than the starter. This in turn requires cutlery that is slightly bigger and heavier. Have a look at this table setting. What do you notice about the main course knife and fork? The main course knife and fork are the biggest items of cutlery on the table. To show this, hold the starter knife and main course knife next to each other. The main course knife is much larger. After appearance and purpose comes placement. Can you remember the rule on where to place knives and forks when paired? When a knife and fork are paired, the knife is always placed on the right-hand side of the setting, and the fork is always placed on the left-hand side. The same is true of the main course knife and fork. The knife goes on the right-hand side and the fork on the left. They are set opposite each other with enough space to place the main course plate down in between them. Lastly, replacement cutlery. If you don't have any main course knives and forks, the best solution is to use the next biggest size of cutlery that you have available to you. This may mean that your starter knife and fork will be used for your starter and your main course. If this is the case, simply place your starter knife and fork in the positions where you would find your main course knife and fork. Remember, however, that just because the same cutlery is being used for the different courses, that new, clean cutlery still needs to be fetched and brought to the guest for the main course. Have a look at this place setting for a right-handed guest. If you remember all the points made during this lesson, you'll quickly be able to spot what's wrong with this picture. Write down what you notice. Well done if you noticed that the knives and forks were placed down on the wrong side. Another well done if you saw that the starter and main course cutlery were swapped. And a special well done if you noticed that the one fork's design was different to the rest. This is what your setting should look like. The fish knife and fork. The next pieces of cutlery we're going to look at are the fish knife and fish fork, which are used for most fish dishes. We'll be looking at the appearance and purpose of fish cutlery, placement, where to place them on the setting, and replacement cutlery, what to do if you don't have fish cutlery available. As usual, let's start with appearance and purpose. As you can see, the fish knife looks slightly different to the other types of knives. It is a pointed knife with a blunt blade. This is because this knife is used to separate the delicate segments of fish, rather than actually cutting through the fish. You'll also notice that the fish knife has a pointed tip, which can be used to slip in between the skin and the flesh of the fish. While most fish dishes will be served with a fish knife, there are also exceptions. If you are serving heavy fish that is not flaky, such as a tuna steak, it is best served with a serrated knife or steak knife for the guest to cut through the fish. The fish fork is similar in size to the starter fork, since both are used for lighter meals. But the fish fork looks slightly different. What do you notice here? The fish fork also has 4 prongs, but with a deeper rift between the middle 2 prongs. To help you remember which is the fish knife and fork, think of the dish that it is used for. Fish is not a heavy meal, but is usually delicate and light compared to the main course, just like the fish knife and fork when compared to the main course knife and fork. Let's take a look at where the fish knife and fork are placed. Just as with the other knives and forks we've looked at, the fish knife is always set on the right-hand side, and the fish fork is always set on the left-hand side of the plate. Whenever a flaky fish course is ordered, this is the cutlery that needs to be set down. The fish course is usually enjoyed before the main course, and so will be set outside the main course cutlery. Lastly, let's move on to the replacement cutlery. Some establishments have moved away from using special fish cutlery, so if your establishment does not use fish cutlery, or you have run out of fish cutlery, a starter knife and fork will do perfectly as a substitute. This is because it is smaller, lighter, and more delicate than the main course cutlery, and will be better suited to separating the delicate fish. To summarize, you should have learnt the following in this lesson: the appearance and purpose of fish cutlery, the placement of fish cutlery, and the proper replacement cutlery if you don't have fish cutlery. If you had trouble answering these questions, rewatch this lesson to pick up on all the points. Remember to find out the steak knife. In this lesson, we'll be learning about the following: the appearance and purpose of the steak knife, the placement of the steak knife, and the proper replacement cutlery if you don't have a steak knife. Firstly, appearance and purpose. The steak knife is used specifically for cutting steak or tougher meat dishes. This knife has a very sharp, serrated blade that is specially designed to cut through meat. This allows guests to cut through meat easily and effortlessly, rather than having to struggle with a normal knife. Can you imagine how a guest would struggle to cut through a steak with a starter knife? But a beautifully sharp steak knife guides through the meat easily. Next, placement. By now, you can probably guess where the steak knife is placed. The steak knife is used with a fork. So, just as with other knives that are paired with forks, the steak knife will always go on the right-hand side of the plate. The main course fork is often paired with the steak knife because it is similar in size and goes on the left-hand side. Dishes containing heavier meats, such as steak, are usually served as a main course, so the steak knife will most often be placed nearest to the plate, on the inside of the other items of cutlery. Finally, replacement cutlery. If your establishment does not have steak knives, a main course knife is the next best option because it is also slightly serrated and would work better than a knife with a smooth edge, such as a starter knife. After this lesson, you should know exactly the appearance and purpose of the steak knife, its placement on the setting, and which knife is the best replacement cutlery for a steak knife. Well done. The next piece of cutlery we're going to look at is the butter knife. We'll be looking at the appearance and purpose of the butter knife, placement, where to place it on the setting, and replacement cutlery, what to do if you don't have a butter knife available. The butter knife is a small, rounded knife with a wide blade that is specifically designed for spreading butter. This is a small, dainty knife which fits neatly onto the side plate or the side of the butter dish. Hold the butter knife and the main course knife next to each other and notice the size difference. The butter knife is much smaller and shorter than the main course knife, and its wide blade is perfect for slicing and spreading butter. Have a look at the following two scenes and see which one looks right. Based on what you just saw, which side do you think the butter knife should be placed? You're correct if you said the left. Since most guests are right-handed, it is much more comfortable to butter bread across your body, holding the bread in your left hand and the butter knife in your right. If it were set on the right, it would be awkward for the guest to move their wrist with their elbow cocked to the side, as opposed to if it were set on the left. They might even bump into another guest on the side. Some of you might have noticed that this sets the butter knife apart from all the other knives we've discussed so far. All the other knives were paired and used with forks, and so, according to the rule, were placed on the right. The butter knife, on the other hand, is used on its own, and as you saw, is much more comfortable on the left-hand side of the setting. In fact, the butter knife is the only knife ever placed on the left-hand side, so it's an easy exception to remember. The butter knife is also different in that it is placed with the blade facing away from the setting, making it easy to pick up and butter the bread. If your establishment does not have butter knives, a starter knife is a perfect replacement because it's similar in size. So by now, you should know and understand these main points: the appearance and purpose of the butter knife, placement, where to place it on the setting, and replacement cutlery, what to do if you don't have a butter knife available. Well done if you could remember all three. The cheese knife. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the cheese knife. We'll talk about its appearance and purpose, its placement on the setting, and as always, which replacement cutlery to use if you don't have a cheese knife. So let's start with appearance and purpose. So, which knife is it? As the name suggests, the cheese knife, this one, is used during the cheese course. You'll notice it has a rather unique shape. It has a thin, sometimes curved blade and fork-like spokes at the end of the knife. The thin blade is to finely slice the cheese, as well as any accompaniments served with the cheese, such as grapes or figs. It also has fork-like spokes at the end to pick up the slices of cheese or accompaniments and place them onto a biscuit or bread. Let's take a look at where the cheese knife is placed on the setting. When the cheese is served with bread or a cracker, the cheese knife is usually not paired with a fork, since the cheese and crackers can be eaten elegantly. On the other hand, the cheese knife is often paired with a starter fork if the cheese is enjoyed without a biscuit. As you can imagine, the guest doesn't want to stick the knife or their fingers into their mouth. Rather, the starter fork can be used. And so, because it is paired with a fork, placing the cheese knife follows the usual rule. When a knife is paired with a fork, the knife is placed on the right-hand side of the setting. Finally, replacement cutlery. If your establishment does not have cheese knives, a starter knife also works well. However, if this is the case, be sure to place a starter fork down too, because a starter knife doesn't have the prongs that the cheese knife does. This will allow the guest to pick up both cheese and preserves with the starter fork. Why do you think starter cutlery is the best substitute? The reason why starter cutlery is used as a substitute for a cheese knife is because the items are small and delicate enough to accompany a cheese course, which is generally a lighter course. So, to summarize, you now know the appearance and purpose of the cheese knife, its placement on the table setting, and which replacement cutlery to use if you don't have cheese knives at your... The oyster fork. In this lesson, we'll look at a dainty little piece of cutlery called the oyster fork. we'll be looking at the appearance and purpose of the oyster fork, placement, where to place it on the setting, and replacement cutlery, what to do if you don't have an oyster fork available. Let's start with the appearance and purpose. The oyster fork is used when the guest is enjoying oysters. This is one of the smallest forks you will ever see. It has 3 short, wide prongs which can be slid under the flesh of the oyster and used to cut the oyster out of its shell for the guest to enjoy. The oyster fork can also be used to squeeze the lemon or lime juice onto the oyster by piercing the lemon or lime. Now let's look at the placement. The oyster fork is an unusual piece of cutlery, but its placement makes sense when you know how the guest will use it. When eating oysters, the fork does most of the work. The oyster shell is held in the left hand, while the fork to lift the oyster from the shell in the right hand. This means that the oyster fork is used on its own. There's no oyster knife. And so the oyster fork doesn't follow the rule of a paired set of knives and forks. Unlike most forks, the oyster fork is placed on the right-hand side of the setting, the side that the guest will hold it. Also, oysters are usually served as a starter, so the fork is set on the outside of the other cutlery. Lastly, let's finish off with the replacement for the oyster fork. If you don't have oyster forks at your establishment, use the next smallest fork available, which may be a snail fork or a starter fork. To summarize, you should now know the following: the appearance and purpose of the oyster fork, where to place it on the table, and what to do if you don't have one. Well done if you could... The teaspoon and demi-tasse spoon. In this lesson, we'll look at the 2 smaller spoons, the teaspoon and demi-tasse spoon. We'll be looking at the appearance and purpose of these spoons, their placement, either on the setting or with the beverage, and their replacements, what to do if you don't have one of these spoons. As usual, appearance and purpose. By now, you would have noticed that there is a relationship between the size of the cutlery and the dish with which it is served. Starters are smaller and lighter and are served with cutlery that is smaller. Mains are generally heavier and more substantial, so they are served with heavier, larger pieces of cutlery. The same is true of the spoons you will use during service, as you'll see in this lesson. The demi-tasse spoon and the teaspoon are both small spoons and usually accompany beverages such as tea, coffee, or espressos. The demi-tasse spoon is the smaller of the 2. So, when do you think the demi-tasse spoon should be used? The demi-tasse spoon is the smaller of the 2, and so is usually used when serving espressos. The cup is smaller, and so the spoon should be too. It is also perfect for accompanying small sugar bowls or for enjoying an amuse-bouche. These dishes are also small and dainty. The teaspoon, on the other hand, is used when serving tea, coffee, and other hot beverages in standard-sized cups or mugs. For example, cappuccinos and americanos. Next, let's learn about placement. When either of these spoons are served with hot beverages, you should place them behind the cup, with the handle facing the guest's right hand. This makes it easier for the guest to pick up the spoon, rather than having to reach around the cup to reach the handle from the left. Remember how we adjusted the placement of knives and forks for a left-handed guest? Do you think something similar can be done with a teaspoon? If you thought that the handle should face to the left, well done. Lastly, let's finish off with replacement cutlery. If you don't have a demi-tasse spoon, a teaspoon is an adequate substitute. The same applies the other way around. What is important, however, is that the same sized spoon is used consistently throughout service. This means that if you must serve an espresso with a teaspoon, all the espressos must be served with a teaspoon. This way, your service will be consistent and your guests will appreciate your attention to the finest details. To check that you remember the main points of this lesson, see if you can spot anything wrong in this picture. Well done if you noticed that the tea was served with a demi-tasse spoon, which is inconsistent and incorrect if a teaspoon is available. Similarly, the espresso was served with a teaspoon when a demi-tasse spoon was available. You should know the following about the teaspoon and demi-tasse spoon: their appearance and purpose, their placement, and the correct replacement cutlery when you don't have either one of the The soup spoon. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the soup spoon, its appearance and purpose, its placement on the setting, and the correct replacement cutlery when you don't have soup spoons. Let's begin with appearance and purpose. The soup spoon has a round bowl, and as the name suggests, is used for soups. You'll notice that the bowl of the soup spoon is too wide to comfortably fit into your mouth. This is because creamy soups are sipped from the side of the spoon. The entire bowl is not placed in the guest's mouth, and so the cream soup spoon with its wide, deep bowl is perfect for sipping. Now let's move on to placement. From what you've learnt about other cutlery, where do you think the soup spoon will go? Think about at which stage of the dining experience soups are generally served. At the beginning. So, the soup spoon will be set towards the outside of the setting. Now think about how the soup spoon will be used. It is not used with another piece of cutlery, and most guests are right-handed. So well done if you figured out that it is placed on the right. Finally, replacement cutlery. If you don't have a soup spoon, a normal tablespoon or dessert spoon are also acceptable replacements. Well done on finishing this lesson on the soup spoon. The dessert spoon and dessert fork. The next set of cutlery items we're looking at is the dessert fork and dessert spoon, their appearance and purpose, their placement on the setting, and the correct replacement cutlery if you don't have one or both of them. Firstly, appearance and purpose. The dessert spoon is larger than a teaspoon with an oval-shaped bowl. The spoon can be used for scooping bites of delicious soft desserts, as well as slicing through harder parts, such as biscuits or pastry. The dessert fork serves a similar purpose. The fork is used for piercing and eating, and the side of the fork can also be used to cut through cakes, tarts, or desserts with harder pastry or biscuit layers. Next comes placement. Now that you know what the dessert spoon and fork are used for, where do you think they will be placed on the setting? Grab your pen and paper and write down what you think. You can also draw a rough picture. If your description or picture looks like this, you're wrong. But if you thought the dessert fork will be placed on the left-hand side and the dessert spoon on the right-hand side, you're right. This is because the fork is often used to hold the dessert, while the side of the spoon is used for cutting, similar to pairing a knife and fork. When setting the table for many courses, the dessert cutlery is sometimes set on top of the setting, with the fork's handle facing left and the spoon's handle facing right. By placing them in this way, they are out of the way of other cutlery used earlier in the dining experience. If this is where you place your dessert spoon and fork, Be sure to pull down these pieces of cutlery to their correct positions before the dessert arrives. This means that the fork will be on the left-hand side, as usual, and the spoon, used for cutting, on the right. If the dessert which has been ordered doesn't need a dessert fork and only needs a dessert spoon, still place the spoon on the right-hand side of the setting, as you would if a dessert fork was present. This is because it is easiest for a guest to use the spoon in their right hand. Let's finish off with replacement cutlery. If you don't have a dessert fork, you can also use a starter fork or a main course fork. Similarly, if you don't have a dessert spoon, a soup spoon will also work. So in this lesson, you've learnt about the appearance and purpose of dessert cutlery, their placement on the setting, and what to do if you don't have either the dessert spoon. Polishing cutlery. You've heard the expression that guests eat with their eyes first. Believe it or not, this doesn't start when a dish is placed in front of them. It starts the minute they walk into a dining area. This means that if the cutlery placed on the table is dull, or even worse, dirty, they'll most likely be put off their food before even tasting it. When it comes to polishing cutlery, the most important thing to understand and to keep in mind is that the cutlery will be going into the guest's mouth, and therefore needs to be spotlessly clean, hygienic, and free from fingerprints. Fingerprints are proof that someone's naked fingers touched the cutlery, and immediately tell your guests that no care was taken in preparing your cutlery. So, to ensure that cutlery will be beautifully polished, there are 9 steps to follow. Step 1. Wash your hands thoroughly. Also make sure that your nails are clean. This limits bacteria or dirt being transferred from your hands to the cutlery. Step 2. Clean the surface with an all-purpose cleaner. The surface on which you will be working must be clean, so that dirt and bacteria aren't transferred from the table or counter to the cutlery. Step 3. Fetch your equipment. You'll need 2 service cloths for polishing, a lined tray to place your beautifully polished cutlery onto, a container of boiling water, and some white vinegar. Step 4. Add 1 capful of white vinegar to the boiling water. The white vinegar is what adds sparkle and shine to the cutlery. Make sure that you find out from your manager whether you use vinegar at your establishment, as it may damage some metals such as silver. Step 5. Check each piece of cutlery before you polish it. If it is dirty, send it back to the scullery. If it is damaged, broken, or in a very poor condition, take it out of your stock and tell your manager immediately. By doing this, you will make sure that the damaged item doesn't make its way onto your guest's table, but your manager will also be able to replace it as soon as possible. Step 6. Dip the cutlery into the vinegar solution. Step 7. Polish the cutlery with the service cloth. Hold the cutlery with the cloth to make sure your fingers never touch the cutlery after you have polished it. This will put your fingerprints onto the beautifully clean item of cutlery, undoing all of your careful work. You can hold the cutlery up to the light to better check for fingerprints. Step 8. Once polished, place the cutlery onto the lined tray. Remember to use a service cloth when placing the cutlery to prevent getting your fingerprints onto the item. And lastly, step 9. Store the cutlery in the appropriate, clean storage area. Remember that whenever you are carrying newly polished cutlery, it should always be carried on a tray which has been lined with a clean service cloth, whether you are packing it away or taking it out to your guests. To better remember the 9 steps, try selecting keywords from each step to remember. For example, Step 1. Wash hands. Step 2. Clean surface. Step 3. Fetch equipment. Step 4. Add vinegar. Step 5. Check damage. Step 6. Dip. Step 7. Polish. Step 8, place. And step 9, store. Make sure you memorize the 9 steps before moving on to the next lesson. Good luck.